Hedges. Hi, welcome to On Contact. Today we're going to be talking with two great anti-trafficking campaigners, Suzanne Jay and Taina Bien-Aime.
A lot of people are making a lot of money off of the backs of the most marginalized women of color.
I think prostitution actually does more definitely damages the individual, but it does damage to the society. It does a widespread damage to the psychology of society as well.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism, truth is not socialism, obedience, counterweight, class war, corporate dictatorship, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. The global trafficking of poor girls and women is a legacy of imperialism and white supremacy. Yet the left has studiously failed to confront this issue. In fact, it has defended the commodification and sexual exploitation of girls and women as a form of work that should be legitimized. Why is it not acceptable for a woman to be exploited and physically abused in a sweatshop, yet is acceptable for her to be exploited and physically abused as a prostituted woman? Why is it unacceptable that the poor are forced into working conditions that are subhuman, often replicating slavery, while we ignore the reality of sexual slavery? Eradicating capitalism does not address the issue of male violence against women. This is a separate evil. And if we do not address this issue, we ensure that half the world's population is prevented from lending their talents and voices in the struggle to make a better world. Anya Parampil looks into the industry of human trafficking.
Human trafficking is an ugly business which is nearly impossible to quantify due to its secretive and illegal nature. Still, we know it's an industry generating an estimated $32 billion worldwide annually, and we have stunning estimations of its scale. It's thought 20.9 million people are bought and sold for their labor worldwide. The International Labor Organization estimates globally 4.5 million are trapped in forced sexual exploitation, though they weren't necessarily trafficked. The UN estimates 53% of trafficking victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation. For women, that number is more like 79%. Fewer men are forced into the sex trade, but it's still prevalent. It's a modern-day slave trade, which erases an individual's identity and reduces them to an international commodity, which can be bought, sold, and smuggled worldwide. When it comes to women and girls in the United States, the State Department determined the average age of entry into the sex trade is 12 to 14 years old. In Atlanta alone, the Urban Institute found the city's illegal sex trade generates nearly $290 million a year, with some traffickers making more than $32,000 a week. So, who are the traffickers? The UN notes that unlike other global crimes, women make up their fair share, with 28% of convicted traffickers being women. However, it's extremely difficult to get convictions in trafficking cases to begin with.
Suzanne Jay and Taina Bien-Aime are part of the global resistance to the human trafficking for girls and women into prostitution. Suzanne is the co-founder, along with Alice Lee, of Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution, based in Vancouver. The organization was influential in putting into place the so-called Nordic law in Canada that criminalizes buying and pimping of prostituted girls and women, while recognizing that these girls and women are survivors, not criminals. Taina, who is an attorney, is the executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, based in New York City. She and her organization work to combat the global trafficking of girls and women. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Let
me begin with you, Taina, because we have seen now the rise of this movement. They're calling it decriminalizing. I'm using their language, not language you would use, decriminalizing sex work. Explain to me the roots of that in terms of, feminism becoming a slut walk, for instance. I mean, how did we get to this point where we are watching self-identified feminists essentially seek to legitimize the oppression of women, because we must remember that 99% of women who are prostituted are poor women of color who are often trafficked into the industrialized world or into urban areas for, abuse by the elites.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, let me start about language, because language is important and it's very confusing. When we talk about decriminalization of the sex trade, we agree with Amnesty that women and girls and trans
Well, we're
people,
talking about Amnesty International.
Right, Amnesty International.
Which is now supporting a proposition to, quote unquote, decriminalize the sex trade.
So the International Board is about to release its decision that would call on governments to decriminalize the sex trade, which includes pimps, buyers of sex, and brothel owners, as a means to protect the prostituted individuals. So what we are saying is we agree with the first part, that people in prostitution, who are overwhelmingly women and girls, boys, trans as well, are part of that exploited population. But we agree that they should not be criminalized for their own exploitation. But you cannot decriminalize the entire sex trade, including Johns and their exploiters, in order to protect the prostituted. So when people hear decriminalization, of course, people just have a reaction to the criminal justice system and say, let's just legalize it. We recognize there's violence in prostitution. We recognize there's stigma. We recognize there's a lot of pain and suffering. So if we legalize it or decriminalize it, which is a worse form of legalization, then the prostituted individuals would have recourse to the police. They would have access to justice. We know for a fact that that is not the case. We know it from Germany. We know it from New Zealand. We know it from the Netherlands, from Australia, that that is not the case. That in fact, if you decriminalize the whole sex trade, what you do is you green light the sex trade itself, right? So trafficking increases, and that's just simple economics equations, right? You have supply and demand. In the countries that have decriminalized prostitution, women have generally opportunities, educational opportunities, economic opportunities to not go into prostitution. All of a sudden, you've got the government saying it's okay to purchase women for sex. They're commodities.
Well, we should raise the issue of Germany. Maybe you can speak to that, Suzanne, because there you have a situation where prostitution has been, quote unquote, decriminalized. It's legal. And yet, all of the advances that women were supposed to make under this legalization have, in fact, not happened.
They've not materialized. And I would say that German women have probably been pushed back. In Germany, over 1 million men a day will buy a prostituted woman. And it's estimated, and they even with having legalized and making those claims about registering women, they still can't get a grip on the number of women who are prostituted.
But because they won't register.
That's right. It's estimated there's 400,000 women who are prostituted. Many of them are from Eastern Europe, Nigeria, women of color, escaping poverty and escaping war. And fewer than 50 of those women have registered. And I'm probably exaggerating. It's probably fewer than 30 women have actually registered to take advantage of the promised social services.
Out of estimated how many?
400,000.
400,000. Let's talk about the issue of consent, because that's used, in essence, to justify prostitution. It's not rape, they say. This is something consensual.
Mm-hmm. So we have to be very careful again about language, because consent is a term that has been used throughout the struggle for equality for women, right? So domestic violence, for instance, she consented to stay with him. She was empowered to leave, but she did not. Same thing with sexual violence and rape. She consented to have him come into her home, to wear a short skirt, et cetera, et cetera. So consent is a very, very dangerous term outside of a sociocultural and gender analysis context. The other thing is people can self-identify as they wish. If you want to identify as a quote-unquote sex worker, not a term we use because prostitution is neither sex nor work, it's a form of violence against women.
Rachel Moran calls it being raped for a living. This is of former
Right.
prostitute women who wrote a book called Paid For, right?
But in our society, unfortunately, money is seen as consent within the context of prostitution, when prostitution, in fact, is not an exception to violence against women, and it's a cause and consequence of gender inequality. So the dichotomy is, on the one hand, we've got governments and civil society that is starting to understand equality, that really wants to work to end domestic violence, sexual violence, to work for equal opportunity, for equal pay. But then we have what I call gender apartheid, where you have the most marginalized and vulnerable people on the planet, and we're saying, we have a job for you, and money will be that consent.
And Suzanne, this is really a legacy of colonialism.
Absolutely.
And imperialism.
It is imperialism played out on women's bodies. And it's not. We recently have been dealing with the comfort women issue. 200,000 women were conscripted by the Japanese army to be provided to the men in the Japanese camps. And so that's become a controversy now that those comfort women are dying. And they were kidnapped from Asian Pacific countries in that area that Japan was an imperialist power in. But
we should throw in there that those brothels were kept open for American troops after the war didn't end.
That's right. Within 3 days of the Americans invading Japan, occupying Japan, the Japanese had established comfort stations for the Americans, and they used their own women. 70,000 women were provided to the American troops, and that kick-started the sex trade industry in Southeast Asia, so that when the American GIs went to Vietnam, those agreements were in place already.
Well, we
in
still
Thailand.
saw it in the Philippines.
Yes, that's right.
And then once those U.S. forces depart, instead of serving the military forces, it becomes sexual tourism. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Suzanne Jay and Taina Bien-Aime.
Earlier today, President Obama
Senate Republicans previously stated that the component responsible for poisoning people in Flint.
there was always hope.
That's what goes on with our politicians. What are women supposed to do? Here's something else we know.
Between the U.S.
Lawyers
and
at
Cuba.
the ACLU have already some degree of loss in
It's a
business.
huge difference.
Following the announcement, oil prices.
Nobody's talking about the story because it's garbage.
Real, genuine, and significant change.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? What's your biggest fear in life? Ever been on a hayride? When's the last time you read a book? What would you say if you ever met the Pope? Who's the best quarterback of all time? What's one topping that doesn't belong on a pizza? Now, I've interviewed you too. Question more.
I'm Tom Hartman, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture.
There's been no charges filed.
And when you question more, you find what you're looking for.
This is the legislative branch of the party.
We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with anti-trafficking activist Suzanne Jay and Taina Bien-Aime. Let's go back to this discussion of prostituted girls and women and imperialism and colonialism. Edward Said writes about this, the great scholar on Orientalism. We've also seen it with extraction industries, the creation of man camps, where whether you're mining copper or you create fracking these centers, and immediately, and often on indigenous land, First Nations land in Canada, you see springing up around these. Maybe you can begin by addressing that, Suzanne, then I'll get your...
Well, we know that in Papua New Guinea there's over 100 women who are bringing rape charges against a Canadian company that's doing open pit gold mining in their country. And that's only the women who are able to actually get a hearing.
We just saw in Okinawa recently another case where a U.S. Marine murdered a woman.
That's right. A really terrible case where a man who is an ex-Marine but a civilian employee of the Kadena Air Force Base picked up a woman. He was just driving around and he picked up a random woman. He has admitted now to raping her and then stabbing and strangling her and dumping her body. And so the Okinawans have been demonstrating for years and trying to push the American military out of Okinawa, which is an indigenous island, and in which 50 or 60% of the American forces in Japan are based.
Right.
And
but all of these concentrations, as a corollary, and this was also true in colonialism, by design, create systems where women and girls are forced into prostitution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, prostitution was never inevitable, it was invented. And it was invented through a very lethal recipe of patriarchy, imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, right? Professor Orlando Patterson talks about women as currency. So it's, yes, women as currency throughout times of slavery and imperialism and colonialism, right there, the spoils of war, etc. But you also have to bring it back to sexual access to women, male sexual access to women. Because if you look at other forms of harmful cultural practices, and prostitution is definitely our harmful cultural practice, but whether it's child marriage, female genital mutilation, denial to reproductive justice, and the list goes on, it is all about male sexual access. So again, within our structures, we have identified money as a means of consent and a means of empowerment. Very, very powerful words that are very evocative of what it means to be human, what it means to live in a democracy, what it means to achieve equality. And the sex trade has totally co-opted that language.
Well, it's the commodification of human beings, which is writ large now across the culture. And I'm going to read you a few lines from a recent New York Times article that I know you've responded to and you both read, called "Should Prostitution Be a Crime?" Which really calls for the legalization of pimping and trafficking of women. And in this article, it goes, the traditional feminist argument against decriminalization is that legitimizing prostitution will harm women by leading to more sexual inequality. The human rights argument for it is that it will make people's lives better and safer. In this fight over whose voices to listen to, who speaks for whom, and when to use the power of criminal law, the sex workers' rights movement is a rebellion against punishment and shame. It demands respect for a group that has rarely received it, insisting that you can only really help people if you respect them. Suzanne.
In this fight, it's not actually sex workers' rights that are being fought for, it's the pimps' rights. It's the pimps and the johns who are fighting for the right to access women's bodies. And it's only their lives that possibly might be made easier. Criminal organizations, the men who are running criminal organizations, who are doing the human trafficking, who are profiting from the advertising of the women in urban centers, they're the ones whose lives are going to be made better if prostitution is fully decriminalized for them. For women, what we've seen is that it becomes an open pit for them. They're dumped into it.
Explain. What do you mean by that?
The way to end prostitution, the way to advance women's liberation, is to find ways to prevent men is to challenge the patriarchy. The decriminalization of prostitution does nothing to do that. It reinforces white sexual imperialism. It reinforces the male ownership of women. It reinforces male right to orgasm over the human rights of any woman or girl.
There's so many things wrong with Emily Bazelon's article.
This is the author of this article.
Emily Bazelon wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine that is really an opinion piece, and I think the New York Times public editor really needs to clarify what the purpose of the New York Times Magazine does. Is it investigative journalism, in which case this article is not, or is it an opinion piece? And the question, should prostitution be a crime, is the wrong question. The question is, should women be available for sale? And women should not be, and girls and prostituted individuals should not be criminalized for their own exploitation. The other point is that Bazelon separates feminists from human rights activists,
well,
as if we were not one.
I want to get into that because, as I think we brought up before, which we didn't get into, but there's been a redefinition by large segments of the society about what it means to be a feminist. We've gone from Andrea Dworkin to Judith Butler, and maybe, when we can both address that issue, I'll let you start.
Well, feminism means one thing, and that is the movement to achieve equality between men and women, and the recognition that women are full human beings, right? And it's a simple one. There aren't 16 flavors of feminism. There is one feminism. And that's based on human rights, right? Because everybody, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has a fundamental right, among other things, to live a life of dignity and a life free of violence. And you can't divide human rights, right? You can't cherry pick and say, okay, women, you may have access to equal pay, but you're not going to have access to XYZ, including a life free of violence. Or you could have a life free of violence, but if we're going to bring in the sex trade, then you can identify as a sex worker, which is really a term that's invented by the sex trade to mainstream and mask the harms of prostitution, and everything will be Pretty Woman, or the girlfriend experience.
You're referring to this movie,
the Hollywood movie,
because which very few middle-class white women. I mean, this is, I think, what we can't stress enough is that the industry of prostitution is built around the bodies of poor, largely women of color, sometimes from Eastern Europe.
Absolutely. The International Labor Organization in 2014 estimated that the illegal profits from the global sex trade is at $90 billion. Wow. And the ILO doesn't even recognize prostitution as, as something that could be involved in sex trafficking. Unfortunately, they look at it as a form of labor. So imagine that number could be double or triple. So a lot of people are making a lot of money off of the backs of the most marginalized women of color.
And I think, before we close here, I want to deal with the issue of trauma. And I had written the longest chapter in my book, Empire of Illusion. The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle is on the porn industry. I was a war correspondent and so have dealt with PTSD. And when I started doing interviews, it was instant. All of these women have PTSD. We know that women and girls who are prostituted have much shorter life expectancies. Maybe you can begin by addressing the psychological and maybe even to a certain extent the physical consequences of being prostituted.
I think that all women face the threat of rape through our lifetimes. I think prostitution actually does definitely damages the individual, but it does damage to the society. It does a widespread damage to the psychology of society as well.
I want to talk about what it does, the trauma, because I think we have this. We're talking about prostitution as if it's another form of work. It's about the psychological and physical destruction of the individual.
Yeah, it's true. All male violence is designed and has the function of keeping women down. It serves the purpose of oppressing women. Like whether or not you're prostituted, whether or not we're raped, those two threats are very effective in controlling women, in controlling girls and women through the course of our lives. And so they are also very effective forces in preventing us from having full and equal, meaningful participation in society.
So the medical community has not yet provided any data or statistics on what serial, unwanted, monetized sexual invasion, anal invasion, vaginal invasion, bodily invasion does to human beings, both physically and psychologically. You have the HIV/AIDS sector, which really focuses more, and I'm not going to demean the HIV/AIDS efforts because they're critical in preventing this devastating disease. But when it comes to the sex trade, women are far more complex than prevention of HIV/AIDS. Right. And yet, the only public health people we hear from at a global scale is from the HIV/AIDS people. And some people would say that their concern is more about protecting the buyer's population and his community rather than the women who, if you take a case like India, where you have 3 million women and girls in prostitution, highly fungible population. So we really do need the medical community to come together and not just look at the harms of trafficking, right? Because the trafficking is just a means, but really what harms do both the pimps and the Johns confer on women?
Great. Thank you very much. Prostitution is the quintessential expression of global capitalism played out on poor women's bodies. We are all being debased and degraded, rendered impoverished and powerless to service the cruel and lascivious demands of male patriarchy and capitalism. And when our masters tire of us, or when we are no longer of use, we are like these girls and women discarded as human refuse. If we accept prostitution as legal, as permissible in a civil society, we will take one more collective step toward the global plantation being constructed for us all. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.